begin the night, if I can find my questions. Oh, yes, I will introduce you, yes. Mark Slade.
I'm not too well known.
Mark, would you like to just briefly tell us who you are?
So, my name is Mark, and I'm the convener of the Cambridge Green Party, and I'm also a committee member on the Cambridge Free Europe group.
Which means you think we should stay here?
Yes.
Would you like to tell us a bit about you, please?
Thank you, I'm Nick Clark. I used to be the leader of the County Council in 2013. As a Conservative, I left the Conservative Party because I believe there needs to be a clear, strong message about leaving the EU. I joined UKIP and stood as the Peace and Quiet Commissioner.
Steve.
I'm Steve Maston. I'm Head of History at the Village College here, and I live in Cambridge, and I used to be strongly Remain, and I am definitely not now.
Okay. And last but not least, Brian.
Hi, I'm Brian Mills. I'm a local resident. I do business consultancy generally, and have some clients in Europe, so I've got some knowledge of how dealing with European companies is, and I'm here to argue for staying in.
So I'm going to ask 4 questions, and then I'm going to ask a question for each of the panellists to come back at us with. And then
we're struggling to hear.
The sound is
you do need to speak directly into the microphone, and it's very helpful, Charlotte, if you shut the other mics down when one person is talking. That helps a lot. If you've got a question, it would be very helpful if you could address it to a particular member of the panel. It doesn't mean the other members of the panel can't come in on the record. What does that mean? I think it is. Right. Now I've got a problem. Can I have the radio mic, please, Rob? That's playing up. We'll have to get that addressed. Thank you very much. If you ask a question of one of the panelists, it doesn't mean the others can't come in. But I have said to them, if you've got something really significant to say, come in on it. But we don't want to get into the situation where every panellist feels they have to answer every question, or one question can take a long time. So we're ready to go. I'm going to fire the first one on Steve. I know Steve because I've been up to the college quite a few times. Spent a bit of time up there with the group that he runs. Steve, you're always heading over to Europe with students, teaching them about the things that happened in the war and the way that things fell apart over there. I'm intrigued that as a history teacher, knowing that history, you think that we should separate from Europe. I'm intrigued.
No, I don't think we should separate from Europe. I'm a European. I'll always be a European. I'm a passionate European. I will always holiday in Italy. It's my favourite country in the world. I will always buy French wine. I will always buy Spanish rioja. I will always drive a German car. I am a European. My culture is European. The European Union and Europe are not the same thing. When I was growing up, to me, the European economic community as it was then, which has now changed into what we now call the European Union, felt like the future. I grew up when we still had the Cold War, when we had big trading blocks, and that seemed to be the way the world was going. And I'm sure those of you who were alive when we had the last referendum probably voted on that basis, that we were going into a common market, a trading bloc, and it made a lot of sense in the world in the 70s. I totally understand that. In fact, if you'd asked me a year ago, I would have said I was voting to stay in, because I desperately hoped that the Prime Minister would come back with reforms of this unaccountable, undemocratic, corrupt institution called the European Union. I desperately wanted it to work. I've come to the conclusion that reform is not possible. The best we got was the handful of beans that the Prime Minister came back with, which Jack would have been embarrassed to show to his mother, of beanstalk fame. Interestingly, he hasn't made a big thing of the reforms that he so-called achieved this summer. So when it comes to your question about Europe and war and tension, etc., I don't think it will make any difference to the tensions within Europe as a continent whether we are inside the European Union or whether we are outside of it. I think the tensions that exist at the moment as a result of the European Union itself, and can I give 3 brief examples? The first is the Greek government. It doesn't matter whether you vote left-wing or right-wing in Greece, because the economic levers of power in Greece are wielded by the European Central Bank, because Greece is part of the Eurozone. It's irrelevant how you vote in Greece. Second, unemployment for young people across the south of Europe is up to 40–50%. Tension is growing, there are protests on the street. That is not the fault of the British staying in or going out. And the third is the very frightening rise of the far left and far right. The fact that a far right candidate almost became president of Austria terrifies me, and that's in a European Union country. The increasing tensions in European Union countries are because people are fed up and they can't vote at an election to improve their lot, because elections don't really count anymore for European Union.
Thanks very much, Steve. Right, I think I mic 2, radio mic 2. Radio mic 2, thank you, that's good. Brian, you're part of the Lib Dems, and you were just telling me a little while ago that the Lib Dems are quite united. They think we should stay in the EU. Now you can tell by my accent that I will have a certain perspective. When Britain joined the European market, Australia lost out really badly because we were selling our wheat and our wool to Britain. We were favoured trading, you know, and we fought with you in the war. We came and fought in Europe for Britain, mother country and all that. Felt really betrayed. If we pulled out of the European Union, wouldn't it enable Britain to be able to form all sorts of trading alliances all over the world that could really free up our markets?
Conflated the 2 questions you asked me. So there are 2 answers, which was yes and no. So, could we set up new arrangements with other people around the world? Yes. Should we go global and leave Europe behind? No, is my simple answer. I'm sorry about leaving the Australians and New Zealanders. But you're suggesting in that when we're already in a tariff-free agreement with some countries and doing a lot of trade with them, rather like we were with Australia and New Zealand, we should leave them and go somewhere else. And if you're asking if that would be a good thing to abandon that agreement and start over so that we could create other tariff-free agreements with a whole set of other countries, then I couldn't agree with that at all. Because partly it's going to be the same countries. So we've got 2 years in which the leaving process takes place. In that 2 years, we would have to replace the agreements that we have by dint of being part of Europe with the rest of the world. An example of somebody who's done that is Canada, who have come up with a comprehensive economic trade agreement. It was the second time to try to get an agreement with Europe. It's taken them 8 years. It's agreed but not yet implemented. It's taken them 8 years for an agreement that the exiters would have us believe is very straightforward. It clearly isn't. And that, for me, is the nature of the problem. That we're looking to replace agreements, but we can't get an agreement with the individual 27 other members of Europe. We have to do a deal with the EU. But we've already got one. It's a free trade agreement. And 94 other countries are trying to do deals with the EU to give us what we're saying we want to do by ourselves. And for me, it's a bit of a nonsense to try and negotiate on our own when we've already got a mechanism in which to do that.
Thank you very much indeed, Brian. You realise this is just to get you thinking and to get the areas going. Nick, I'm going to put the next one to you. A lot of people are very worried about our porous borders, about people being able to travel freely across Europe. So if some jihadist gets into Europe, down in Greece, they can travel to Britain without a problem. So it's a security problem in people's minds. But on the other hand, I've heard the argument that if we leave Europe, we're going to lose all sorts of connections with European law enforcement, which is giving us vital information that is keeping our country safe. What do you think?
Thank you. I think first of all that the UK, as a member of Interpol and as a member of a network of security and police organisations across the world, those networks will continue and flourish whether we're in the EU or whether we're out. The political and financial experiment of the EU has nothing to do with the security in a positive sense. It is clear that the rest of Europe, the police forces and the security organisations will continue to cooperate with the UK. We've got really good relations actually across the world as well. We've got the Five Eyes countries, which are the American, Canada, Australia and New Zealand. Fantastic information sharing with them, and that's not a product of the EU. We've also got the Lancaster House Treaties of 2010, bilateral treaties with France, which guarantees defence and security cooperation. Again, nothing to do with the EU. So international security is a global issue that requires global cooperation, not just from a political union. The reality is that friendly countries share information, particularly on security. Security forces across the globe have very comprehensive networks, and I see nothing that will change that. And in fact, being in the EU is completely irrelevant. And one of the habits of the EU, unfortunately, is that when it sees some success out there, in any form, shape or fashion, it seems to claim that it's a product of the EU. And I was surprised to not hear on the radio this morning that glorious sunshine was not a product of the EU. We know that the EU's borders are porous. Under the Schengen agreements, there are no internal borders. Once a migrant enters the EU, there is nothing to stop them freely moving from Athens to Antwerp under EU law. And when they've gained the right to settle within the EU, in time they would have the rights to reside in the UK. And we know there are people out there in the world who wish to do us harm. We accept the fact that many asylum seekers, most of the asylum seekers, are legitimate, peaceful people, but not all of them, I'm afraid. Last year, the UK issued 697,000 new national insurance certificates to new EU arrivals. So it's equivalent to the entire population of Bristol. So let's be clear. We live in an increasingly dangerous world, and we're witnessing clashes of cultures, which often erupts in violence. It's only by leaving the EU that we can protect our borders domestically.
Thanks, Stephen. Mark, there's a whole heap of people in our country at the moment who are very concerned about fracking. And there's a lot of people who are very worried that if we leave the EU, a whole heap of environmental safeguards that are built into the EU will get jettisoned. But on the other side, we've got a massive population growth that is happening largely because of the EU, and that's threatening our green belts out there, and all sorts of habitats are getting swallowed up by human beings. Is it a good or a bad thing to be staying or leaving?
Well, interesting enough, I organised an event in Cambridge, similar to this one, 2 weeks ago, with a panel including Lord Deepman, who's the chair of the Parliamentary Climate Change Committee, with Craig Bennett, who's the CEO of Friends of the Earth, Tony Juniper, who's a leading British environmentalist, and a lady called Hannah Temple, who is a leading activist in a pan-European environmental group. And their view was unanimous. Staying in the EU is beneficial for our environmental policies. And now we've seen 2 or 3 days ago that WWF and the RSPCB have also come out to support the Remain campaign, saying that our environmental policies and the green, with a small g, future of the UK is safeguarded by the EU. It's quite clear that the biggest issues facing the planet today are transnational, and they require strong international cooperation. Climate change, depleting resources, biodiversity loss, population growth as well. These are not restricted by national borders. They're transnational. And it's through institutions such as the EU that we'll be able to tackle these problems and find serious, long-lasting solutions. We can look at an example in the 80s, Britain was known as the dirty old man of Europe because we were emitting very high levels of sulfur dioxide into the environment. This was being carried by the wind into the countries in Scandinavia, Denmark and northern Germany, which was causing high levels of acid rain. And that's an example of how the problems are transnational. And it was through negotiations in the EU that we reached the Gothenburg Protocol, which meant that all nations in Europe were going to have emission ceilings, including sulfur dioxide. And the UK was involved in those negotiations from the start. And was able to fight for its interests and secure what it needed, and that's why it signed that treaty willingly. So I think being a member of the EU gives us this opportunity to really work together with our neighbours. And we've seen that in the UN talks on climate change because the EU has always acted as a bloc. And it's the EU as a bloc that has been pushing for higher targets on emissions, including being carbon neutral by 2050 and all this stuff. Maybe it gives me time to get onto immigration, but maybe that question will come up a little bit later. I do challenge the assumption that population growth is completely the fault of EU immigration.
Okay, well this is the question that I'm going to ask all of you to respond to. It's so intriguing to hear the different responses to this one. I've got friends who love having their European holidays because they don't have to worry about visas or anything. Steve and Roz, who used to run the Greyhound, when they retired, they settled in the south of Spain and they're very happy there, I believe. If we leave the EU, there's all sorts of people who are tied up in this tourist trade, which is just so free. We love our freedom to go across to Europe whenever we like. We'd lose that, but then on the other side, we might have better control of the 742 million people who live there who might just decide on Thursday that they're all going to come and live in Britain. So we'd have a bit of a problem. So what do you think about this type of issue? Tourism and, well, problems to our little island.
Who's that? To me?
Well, you can start.
Oh.
Yeah, you said it. I was somewhere again.
Okay, so I think, well, we don't know what's going to happen, that's clear, because there is no exit plan at the moment. There's just an idea as to whether we stay or not. There's not an actual plan. So we don't know how it will happen. We don't know how the other countries are going to react to us leaving. We don't know if the EU will collapse completely if we leave or if it won't. There's complete uncertainty as to what happens next. I want to bring up part of that, this idea of clash of cultures, which Nick brought up, because I think that it's through the EU that will tackle those clashes of cultures, because it's all about cultural, it's not all about. Cultural interchange is a massive part of what the EU is about. You can see it in our education with Erasmus programs, allowing students to study anywhere across Europe and be involved in our exchange of ideas, exchange of culture. I think the EU is beneficial towards that. I'm not going to ramble on too much, I'll let the others get involved.
My turn to ramble, I guess.
Yeah.
This is the sort of arguments that I'm hearing all the time for those that wish to remain. When challenged, everything is a bit difficult, a bit uncertain, and therefore we shouldn't do it. But you know, we have a proud history in this country of doing difficult things, of being challenging and taking risk. The idea that in some way, if we leave the EU, which is very different to leaving Europe, that will be towed off the shore of Europe and never be allowed back on. It is just the sort of stuff we're listening to the Prime Minister saying about, who's lost just about all credibility he had left. You know, people will continue to go on holiday to Europe, I can assure you, in the same way that they go on holiday to the United States at the moment, in the same way that they buy houses, holiday homes in the United States and in Canada, in the same way I used to go to Sri Lanka when I had my company there. That isn't going to change. There are visa waiver schemes that have been for years and years and years, and you know, shock horror, before 1973, we we survived very well going to Europe and elsewhere. This is a relatively new organisation. It was put in place after the Cold War, when there are big blocks there to combat each other, but it's been left behind, frankly. I don't see any suggestion at all that the Europeans can afford to not trade with us, not to welcome us, not to make us feel welcome in exactly the same way that we'll make them feel welcome, as we always have done. But I think the big difference is that if we can keep our migration figures under control, and there will be some that say it's good to have large migration, and some that don't like it, it doesn't really matter. If they're under control, the sort of numbers that the people of this country want, then it makes it so much easier for us to be good citizens of the world and accept people who are in real trouble, that need asylum. But at the moment, all the pressure from the Prime Minister is, well, we can't do much about the EU, therefore we're pressing down on everybody else. And that really just isn't fair for the world population.
Steve?
I've heard a lot of people in this campaign say that they want the facts. They don't want opinions, they don't want speculation, they want the fact, because they want to be able to vote on the basis of the facts. So I'm going to deal with two facts that were given, but then the facts moved into speculation. And I'm going to be honest with you and tell you when I'm talking facts and when I'm speculating. So two facts. The first one, Brian mentioned the trade that we do with the EU, and if we left the EU, we might be like Canada, which took 8 years to make a trade deal with the EU, and that is potential. Now, he then moved to speculation to say, and therefore, it would take us possibly, who knows, a long time to do a lot of trade with the EU, and we would lose out. Well, let's reply with a fact, which is that the European Union does more trade with this little island than we do with the European Union. So if the European Union is prepared to lose all of that trade, now I'm moving into speculating, if they're prepared to lose all of that trade, well, that's going to affect their economies. I don't think they're going to be prepared to do that. I think we will come to some sort of an arrangement. I'm speculating, but I think it's in our interests. The other fact that was given was about the Gothenburg Agreement, the things that the European Union does collectively for the environment that have been good. No doubt about that. I'm not saying the European Union is the great Satan, is the devil incarnate. It has done many good things. And so reductions in sulfur dioxide was a good thing. What he didn't say is that 4 countries not in the European Union also joined in that agreement. It is possible to join in agreements that we think are helpful for the environment. We're not left out of them because we're not in the European Union. If they're good for the environment and we think they're great, then our Parliament should be passing that legislation.
Okay, right, thank you.
If only it would.
Vote for them.
I'm going to bring it up a bit, Brian.
That's democracy.
People to hear.
Yeah, thank you.
I was trying not to do that before. Now I'm pointing it right at your nostril. I'll just tighten that up a little bit so it doesn't wind up one of these. There you go.
Well, thank you.
Bit better?
Okay. So this huge bureaucracy of Europe. There's less employees, or about the same number of employees running the European Commission as there are running Leeds City Council. 33,000. That's the size of the bureaucracy that we have to pay for. 1% of our national expenditure in government that goes net to pay for Europe. 1%. In terms of cost of replacing all those trade agreements that I was referring to before, I've no idea. I could get into speculation, I've no intention of doing so. But if you can imagine that we would have to negotiate all of those agreements to continue doing trade in the 2 years of Brexit, then you can imagine that it would take some time to do it. That's all. There's 508 million. Not 700, by the way.
Wikipedia.
Population of the EU is 508 million. Population of Europe is 742. 742.
0.6.
So we should conflate Europe with the EU. The EU has a population of 508 million. There's a lot of conflation going on. We conflate border control with immigration. because we do have control of our borders. Has anybody been abroad and come back and had to show their passport as EU and UK nationals? I'm going to get cut off, but for anybody that I'm slightly older than these gentlemen, and I remember visiting Europe before 1973, and I used to have to help my mum do the money because it was a £10 export on money. You could only take £10 of currency out of the country.
Don't talk to me about getting older. Right, it's time for you to put your questions to the panellists. Has somebody got a question they'd like to ask? Right, and would you like to say who you'd like to address it to?
I'm terribly sorry, but I can't remember all of them.
We've got
the guy at the end.
And Brian.
Brian, yeah. Well, I'm speaking from the point of view of a woman who's concerned with more basic matters, like what everyday life is like for people in England. I noticed you mentioned buying Rioja and travelling abroad. Well, buying goods from Europe, foodstuffs from Europe, the cost of them will go up if we come out of Europe, of the EU. And travelling in Europe would be more difficult because, for example, you won't have the European health card. So if you're sick when you're in Europe, you'll no longer have access to their healthcare systems. And also the use of your mobile phone will go up dramatically when you're in Europe, probably. But the thing that really concerns me is my health and well-being and the health and well-being of other English or British people. Because a lot of the employment legislation which ensures that I and the people I know get an annual paid holiday, people's the length of working hours.
Is this a question?
Yes.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. Maternity leave, etc. Can you assure me or explain to me how these benefits and social rights will continue to improve if we come out of the EU? Because England and the UK has been a laggard in developing these things, so how are they going to improve when Europe has made us improve them so far?
Thanks for that. I do want to reiterate, because they've only got 2 minutes to answer, can you make your questions succinct and clear, please? Because I think that got into the too many issues. That's okay. So one question, put it to the person, let them answer it. Thanks very much. Over to you, Brian.
Yes, I'm not sure I can isolate the question, to be honest. I don't want to get into speculation about what might be there after the decision is made. I imagine that prices temporarily may go up until we get trade agreements in place, but it may not happen. I imagine that the markets will get jittery, the exchange rate of the pound will be hit by that, as we've seen it fluctuating when polls are released just now. I think the fact is that we can organise our affairs perfectly well, but it will take a lot more effort doing it and replacing what we've already got. We would have to, for example, enshrine current European law in solely UK law. So we'd have to decide with those things that we currently encompass that are EU legislation whether we want to continue. So you may say, and I might make a political point, if we go back to a particular political party, whether it's the Labour Party or the Tory Party, what would they take out of EU legislation that they're not happy with?
Yeah, just very quickly, most of the modern day legislation that protect workers' rights actually came in before we joined the EU. The EU has attempted now to enshrine it with its own legislation as well, and we think it's true. back in the 1970s, I would give the Labour Party some credit for this. But the big question that sits above all that is why people have so little faith in elected politicians in this country doing what they need to do. Now, the important point here is that when you don't like them, you vote them out. You cannot do that with the European Commission. They are appointed, and you cannot get rid of them, and they create the law. So some law is good for us, other laws are not. And most of the laws are put in place for the good of the European Union as a whole, irrespective of it's good for us or not.
Yes, if you'd like to pick up.
I'd really like to get involved on this argument about democracy because it's very clear to me that the EU is a far more democratic institution than the British government. Okay? I was not expecting that response actually, I was expecting to get sort of. Okay, let's look at the British system. Okay, we have a House of Commons, which is elected on an undemocratic system. First past the post is a complete ridiculous system. It's completely ridiculous. The MEPs in our parliament are elected for a proportional representative system. The systems or structures are stronger in the EU than they are in this government. The upper house, the House of Lords, is unelected. And they can do all kinds of stuff to mess up laws and postpone them for as long as they want. We've also got the Commission. Yes, the Commission is chosen by our government. So if you believe our government is democratically elected, you believe the Commissioner is also democratically selected. And there are no rules in the EU stopping us directly electing our Commissioner. We can do that. Our government can bring in the law to say we will directly elect our Commissioner. We have chosen not to do so. The structures are there, the structures are democratic, and they are the only check on our government who have very little checks to attack the NHS, to all kinds of stuff. I mean, environmental laws, fracking, and let's not get too much into national politics, but there are no checks on our government, and the EU actually acts as a check. And I think it's very important that we recognise the failures of our own system. And at the moment, the EU is helping us.
Okay, right, well, let's, Steve, are you making a move to a microphone there, were you? Well, you should have a go at it.
If you don't mind.
Go ahead.
It is entirely opinion about whether our system is more or less democratic than the European Union. I respect your view to say that. I'm not a fan of an unelected House of Lords, but we can have a, but that's not what we're talking about. The European Parliament, and it's an interesting term, Parliament, because it doesn't bear any resemblance to any of the national parliaments in member countries in the European Union. I'll just give you two facts. Again, we can speculate after that, but two facts. Normally when you elect a parliament, so you chuck out whatever lot was in, red or blue, you vote in whatever bunch of bozos have the next 5 years to make a hash of things, yeah, whatever, but you vote them in, you vote them out, they initiate legislation because they've been elected on that basis, and if they screw it up, you vote them out again, and all of that legislation that they screwed up can be repealed by the next parliament. Now, the European Parliament has neither of those powers. I have friends who are members of the European Parliament. They can't initiate legislation. The commissioners initiate legislation. Neither can the European Parliament repeal legislation. There are no European directives that are repealed unless the Commission, which you and I can't remove at the ballot box, unless they repeal that legislation. So it's called a parliament, and we do elect them. I mean, do you know how many MPs there are for the East of England? Do you know the names of them all? Okay, 1, 2, I could name you a couple of Tories as well. I mean, we're cobbling together a list here, but the thing is, the way in which these... Well, she's a friend of mine, absolutely, absolutely. But the point I'm making is that these members of the European Parliament can't initiate legislation, so we vote on a manifesto, but they can't initiate it, and they can't repeal the legislation of the previous Parliament. That's simply a fact. If you like that system, I totally respect that. Well, if you like it, if you don't like it, I
want to give people a chance to ask questions. All right, quick one, Brian. All right, grace is allowed in this place. It's a church.
Undemocratic, to me, is being elected with a majority in Parliament on 36% of the popular vote, and then putting through legislation that can't be undone, because you can't sell off the land registry in one parliament and then buy a house.
Right, I'm going You'll have to be real quick. Right, okay, real quick.
Representing a party, UKIP, who felt very hard done by during the last general election.
Absolutely.
Okay. Yes, but that is not what we're talking about. It was still a democratic result. We may not like the system, and we should now be trying to change the system if we don't like it. But if the majority of people in this country want to retain the current system, that's what they get. That is democracy. But you cannot do that in the EU. It is too far remote from the people.
Let's give the audience a go. Who would like to ask a question? Down in the back? Mark, near the camera.
Thank you. I'll give a point of order to start with for the last question. We do have proportional representation in the UK. It might give it away from my accent. You're talking very imperialistic English here, but I'll let that aside. My question is the next Eurozone crisis. There will be a Eurozone crisis. My money's on Italy, 50, 55, Italy, Spain, one or the other. They're Eurozone, we're not. The Prime Minister did not get anything out of his proposed talking to Europe. We're going to be sidelined. If we vote Remain, we have lost all moral authority inside Europe. Anytime the Eurozone crisis, the next crisis that happens, we're going to get told what to do. Germany is in charge. So, us being outside the Euro, and there's a Euro crisis, what do we do then? We're not going to be listened to because the majority are inside the Euro. Do we have to now sign up for the Euro? I don't think that'll happen particularly. But we're sidelined. Britain will not, is a major trading partner with the EU, but we're going to be sidelined inside the European Union because we're not part of the Eurozone. What can we do about that? Sorry?
Is there a question in there?
Yes. What should we do with the next Eurozone crisis when we're not part of the Euro?
Okay, thanks, Mark.
Who would like to pick that up?
That's a good question.
Yeah, I don't mind starting that.
Okay.
Can I just frame it with something? I think that the only way for the EU to work is if you have full EU. That is a single democratically elected parliament, same taxation, homogenised social services, a single army, a flag, a national anthem, all the things that are going there. You have to go all the way, then I can understand that the EU could work. It isn't an environment I want me, my children and my grandchildren to grow up in, but I respect that as a philosophy. Where we are at the moment is in a halfway house. And the point you raise absolutely crystallises that. Because you've got some members of the EU in the Eurozone, some not in the Eurozone. For the EU to work effectively, everybody would have to be in the Eurozone. And we know that causes a real crisis. Greece, in the days gone by, would have devalued their currency, would have all said, wow, what a cheap place to go on holiday, and would have piled in there. Some people would have bought properties and would have sold, we would have bought their goods and they wouldn't have bought ours, and their economy would have rebalanced. You can't do that within the EU. To answer your question directly, what will happen is we will end up paying for the next Euro crisis. And it may be not in an upfront, honest way, but you bet your bottom dollar, somewhere in there will end up paying.
Would you like to pick up on that one, Brian?
Sorry, that's speculation.
But it's all speculation, because we never know.
So I'm with Steve in trying to separate out speculation from what we know. And we don't know very much. All we do know is that the Eurozone is in a mess. Self-inflicted, absolutely. Greece, as a prime example, was borrowing money and being lent money more and more, despite the fact that they were a bad credit risk. If they were a person, they would have had their credit card chopped up and they wouldn't have been able to borrow anymore. The public spending in Greece was a nonsense, and yet Germany and France and the rest of the Eurozone were giving them more and more loans. It was a nonsense. So are we better off out of the Eurozone? Absolutely right. Did we make a loan of 5.7 billion, I think, towards the bailout? Yes, we did, but it's a loan. We will have And part of the thing that David Cameron actually negotiated was no further involvement in that process. So they will be left to themselves. There's a financial mess, and there's potential for crisis coming, said he, speculating, but not very violently.
You want to pick up on this?
It's not terribly convincing to hear a well-respected Liberal Democrat in the community supporting a Conservative Prime Minister's renegotiation reforms. Is that the word we use? Reforms? No. So he said we won't join the Eurozone, and that's now been set in stone. Well, great. I would say, in a non-partisan way, we have Gordon Brown to thank for that, because Blair, and in fact so many in the Remain camp today, saying our economy is going to go down the toilet if we leave the European Union, were the same bigwigs telling us that if we didn't join the euro, we would be left behind and we would go economically backwards. We'd be left in the dark. Well, that clearly hasn't happened. And the eurozone is a really interesting question. Going back to the original question that Bruce asked me about the continent and taking pupils to First World War battlefields and that, it's with a really heavy heart that I say I do fear for the continent of Europe at the moment because of the tensions that are being created by the European Union project. It only seems to go in one direction, the European Union. It can't change direction, at least it gives the impression it can't change direction. And the Eurozone is a good example of that. It's not an economic project, because clearly economically it doesn't help Greece. It's a political project. And if you vote left or right or yellow or green, it doesn't matter in Greece anymore, because the economic levers of power are not in Greece. They are in the European Central Bank in Frankfurt, and that's not an anti-German comment because I love Germany. It is my favourite destination for pupils to go in Europe. But it's just not fair on the Greeks, and the Eurozone will crawl on and on and on, and sooner or later, we're going to have to help Cameron's renegotiations.
Another question from the audience, please. And the gentleman in the green, blue, or whatever it is shirt.
Hello.
Who would you like to address this to, please? Who would you like to address it to?
The gentleman at the end, the keen...
Brian.
David Cameron keeps talking about all these reforms that he's negotiated. He's saying we've got a choice between staying in the EU, leaving the EU, or staying in the reformed EU. Now, these negotiated changes, as I understand it, are not guaranteed. They have to be put to all the various different countries. If one single member of the EU turns down these negotiated terms, there is no negotiation at all. Is that true?
Thanks.
There will be no changes.
Thank you.
The gentleman there.
For me, it's Brian. All right. Thank you. So I believe technically those reforms will need to be passed by every member, every of the 27 member states. So it's quite possible, as in the case of that Canadian economic treaty that I mentioned, that it will stall at some stage. So I don't want to get into speculation. But I do note, for the record, that there's an awful lot of speculation about how we would negotiate in that same context once we have left. And any one of 27 members, after we leave, in renegotiating some deal with the EU, would have to, all 27 would have to agree. Any one of the 27 remaining members could stop any agreement with Britain and the EU after we left. Bruce, you said that the Australians were not very happy when we left them behind.
No, sorry, my question was, if people voted and stayed in the EU, would these negotiated terms take place? That was my question to you.
Sorry, I thought I answered that and said yes.
Right, I think we're,
I thought I answered.
I'm happy with that. I think we'll take another question, please. Yes? The lady over here.
There's Mark at the end. It's a simple question. I'm probably your worst nightmare because I really haven't a clue which way it's going to happen. But simple questions, what would it mean either way for our agricultural industry and fisheries? Simply, you know, either way, do we lose the restrictions that we have if we leave, or do we get better agreements if we stay in, or if we leave? I really, you know, whichever way. So simply, how would it benefit?
It's a good question, thank you.
I'll have to admit, I'm not an expert on agricultural policy, being a city boy myself. However, I know there was a lot of uproar about the fishing policies that the EU brought into place a couple of like a decade ago or 2 decades ago, and you know there were some ridiculous things that came out of that, including we saw these pictures of fishermen refraining fishes back into the sea because they hit predators, blah blah blah. But it was resolved. We went back to the negotiation table. We realised where the flaws were, and it was resolved within the EU, within the negotiations that were done. At the end of the day, fishing is I'm focusing on fishing because I've done a bit of research into that as opposed to agriculture. But the fishing ecosystem, ocean ecosystem and sea ecosystem is very fragile. We need to work with our neighbours on how to ensure we don't destroy it. And we're seeing every single year more plastics being dumped into the sea, more overfishing, more depletion of fish stock, etc. So I think we need to be working with everyone to try and find, and that's what they tried to do with these things. There were some flaws, admittedly. Those flaws were then lined out. They found solutions for them. And I think, okay, as always, we don't know what will happen if we leave. Maybe we get a better deal, maybe we don't. I can't tell you. I think we have to work with people. We have to work with our neighbours and find out. Because these, like I said, very fragile. I'm kind of waffling. The main point was that it's a fragile ecosystem. We need to work with people. And I don't know if it's big farming or small farming or big fishery or small fishing you're mainly looking at. I know for sure that was the British government that was willing to sign off these deals to big fishing companies in Grimsby and Hull, for example. I don't know. I waffled.
Thanks. No, thanks for trying. Oh, Nick, you'd like to come in on this?
Pick up on that.
Yeah, of course you can.
To answer you very specifically, let's deal with fishing first of all. Our fishing, I'll speak as a Cornishman, okay, born and brought in Sawston. The fishing fleet were decimated. Our fishing industry had the guts torn out of it. At worst, when our fishermen realised they weren't going to be able to make a living, they sold their fishing permits to the Spanish. The Spanish hoovered them all up for their factory ships, which in turn are hoovering up all the fish. And the Spanish just do not care about protecting the species out there. Second thing, GM food. This country has a real opportunity to embark on more research with GM food. The rest of the world, not middle class South Cambridgeshire, but the rest of the world needs GM food. It needs crops that are drought resistant, it needs crops that are pest resistant, and we need to stop putting so much pesticide into the environment. The EU is against GM foods. Agricultural industries that are dependent on subsidy because they are a strategic industry for this country. And there is absolutely no reason at all why this government, our government, cannot understand that and subsidise the farmers in the way that this country needs those subsidies. The common agricultural policy that's been around for years is better than it used to be, but by and large has been a complete disaster. It's been there to be protectionist, to prevent third world countries benefiting from our food production and to preserve the French economy.
Thanks very much for that. Another question from the audience. So we'll go to the man down the back there, please. Rob, you go next. I want to ask a local question. As we know, science is a big part of the local economy in South Cambridgeshire and Cambridge. And I know from friends of mine who are oncologists that there is a lot of money comes from the EU towards cancer research. There are joint projects across the whole of the European Union, and a lot of that does come to our region, as well as the people, the scientists, and the money. Now, we heard lots of quotes recently about the amount of money we give to the EU, the amount we get back.
I wondered, and this is an open question for anybody here, what do you think the impact would be to our local region if we did leave the European Union? And is it a good thing in light of the scientific community in our area?
Thank you very much. Who would you like to answer? Steve.
Thank you, Dan. We obviously live in a technological hub in this area. I don't work in that technological hub day to day in school, but my partner does in the science park. And East Anglia is a part of that global technological hub. I think to put all your eggs into one basket, and that basket being the European Union, when it is, apart from Antarctica, the only continent on Earth whose economy is not growing, I think is misguided. Now, I respect those who think that the European Union is the future. I do respect that. As Nick said, it is a philosophical view that we want the European Union to become more integrated and more harmonised. I respect that philosophy. When it comes to science and technology, I don't think that the UK is going to lose out when it comes to that. The money that we send to the European Union and the money that comes back, and a lot has been made about that, facts being thrown about how much exactly it is. But the fact is that the money that comes back to us is earmarked by the European Union where it can be spent, which is why you see signs up in different places with the European Union flag saying this money is from the European Development Fund for this, all that. So, yes, we get money back that we put in, but it's earmarked not by British representatives that we can kick out, but by the European Parliament, which is made up of lots of national parliaments, pooled sovereignty. And if that's a good idea, if you like the idea of pooling sovereignty and earmarked money coming back, great, vote Remain. I'd like all of that to be sorted out at Westminster, and if they make a mess of it, I can kick them out in 5 years' time, whatever colour they are.
Yes, Brian.
So we have a huge bioscience industry around us and growing, and the scientists generally say that the collaboration that goes on between European partners is part of the reason that we have a hugely successful business. And I think that we leave Europe at risk of changing that.
Right, the next question is...
leaving the EU. Thank you.
Sorry. Next question to our gentleman with the red chair.
Yeah, good evening. Just a quick question. If Argentine commandos landed in Port Stanley on June the 24th, would we be more likely to be able to defend the Falkland Islands if we were part of the European Union or if we were out, given that the European Union armed Galtieri with Ectoset missiles, armed Gaddafi, armed Saddam Hussein, and God knows how many other dictators, including Assad? Are we more likely to count on the Anzacs to fight with us in Port Stanley, or are we more likely to wait for the French and the Germans to come in and fight with us?
Yeah, I'll take that one, please. I'm just I don't normally talk to the side where we vote aside this one, but okay, the important thing here is about security, actually, world security from a military perspective. And there are some that claim that the EU has contributed to the partial peace in Europe since its formation. But I will challenge that. The EU has a lamentable record, actually. It failed in the Balkans War, it failed in Cyprus, and it failed in our own Northern Ireland, actually. That could have been very well helped by the EU if it had a will, a capability, and a structure to support it. But it has none of those things. Its current move is to create a European army. Now, the problem with that is that the real organisation that has secured our peace for us is NATO. And NATO was set up after the last war, as you know, and that is a strong structure. It is a military organisation, an ex-military. It knows how to do things pretty quickly, and we shouldn't do anything that weakens it. So I think that a competing EU army, being supported by the US, I have to say, because the US wishes to have less of a financial commitment within the NATO arm, because the particular president of the United States at the moment is that way inclined, isn't the reason for the EU to be flexing its muscles. Look, it's not very good at lots of things. I really don't want it to be not very good at military defence. You know, there are two countries in Europe that have got nuclear weapons, France and ourselves, and thankfully the treaties I mentioned earlier, I mean the bilateral agreement to look after nuclear weapons between France and ourselves. I just have this awful feeling that a bunch of bureaucrats in the EU with a backward look on their pension pack and got the fingers anywhere in nuclear weapons doesn't make sense to me.
Can I make
Of course, Brian, yes, by all means.
Just one point about Ireland. The financing of the Irish Republic, in large part from the EU and to Northern Ireland, was a major factor in the peace negotiations. Without the economic prosperity, which was the Irish tiger, of which I was taking part, I worked for a company in Dunleary, I worked in Northern Ireland during that period. And to see Belfast return to be a normal provincial UK city was a real bonus for me, a real boon. And the EU funding that went into the island of Ireland during those years was a big factor in that.
Can I come back to the gentleman's question directly?
Yes, Steve.
The Falklands, yes. Can I be very pro-European, as I am? Because, as I said, European Union, Europe, very different. Very pro-European in that France has a military, Germany has its military, although historically it doesn't go outside of Germany. Belgium has its military, etc., etc., etc. The creation of a European army increases that remoteness of accountability. So the British Army at the moment, very well respected army around the world. We have the fourth largest military budget of any country around the world. Our military is answerable to Parliament, and our military, that means, is answerable to us. The idea of having British men and women serving in a European army that is answerable no longer to the British Parliament, but to a European body, a supranational body, again, philosophically, make the case for it if you want to, but I don't like the idea of any military body, a supranational one. I'm even a bit queasy about the UN army. It hasn't had a lot of successes over the years. So when it comes to the Falklands, I would say we would count on the allies that we have always counted on and always will count on. If that answers your question.
It does.
Yes.
I'm obviously quite pro-EU. I would support a European army, and if it came in Parliament, I'd be campaigning for Britain to veto. This thing is a democratic thing. If we don't want it, we vote against it. We campaign against it. I don't think the whole of Europe is going to be in agreement on this. I think you're going to find people like yourself, like us, who want to keep national armies in every single country, and they will oppose this.
That would be a majority voting decision, and you would no longer have a veto over a European army. 28 countries would vote on it, and the majority decision would decide a European army. So if Britain voted no, I'm afraid we're stuck with that, and we send men and women to a European army.
I wonder if we might move in a different, if somebody would like to move us in a different direction. Yes, Lucy.
We live today in a global village, a very different world from the 1970s. I've got teenagers, and as I understand it, a lot of young people see themselves as not so much British, not so much European, but as part of the human race. And they want to see global problems solved. I think we all want to see global problems solved, don't we? We want to see stability, whether economic or security, peace, for everybody. And actually we know that that benefits us as well. Are we better placed to see global problems solved in the EU or out of the EU? Can I have an answer from each side?
Who would you like to address it all?
I don't mind. Can we have one from each side, please?
Okay. Well,
No, I'm quite clear about it. I think each item that comes up, each issue, should be dealt with in a sensible and pragmatic way. I just don't understand why we need to limit ourselves to a largely white European group of countries when we're trying to solve our problems. Because, you know, when I was growing up, I think I was in Venice when I was 13, and that was like a remarkable trip for me, the other end of the world. But our kids now, I mean, they've been all over the world, haven't they? We've taken them on holidays, and they look towards the world. And, you know, the world is a smaller place than it used to be. I think the EU stops us looking there. So, for example, just on trade, we're not allowed to strike trade deals with other countries. We have to do it through the EU. If we leave, we go back under the World Trade Organization rules, we take a seat at the top table. In terms of science, there's absolutely no reason at all why we can't continue the huge collaboration efforts that we have in the United States, for example. So I think going through a third layer, the EU, doesn't add anything to it. It will almost certainly slow it down. And where you have a vested interest in certain economies, and there are lots of those, it will certainly happen. You know, this country is fleet of foot, it is modern, it's proud, it's got fantastic history and a great pedigree. We should be able to go and do what we want to, where we want to, in the interest of our children, of this country, and the world as a greater place. We don't have to keep focusing on one very small part of the world, which is the EU.
Brian's dying to say something.
Excuse me. WTO. The president of the WTO has said we'd have to start from scratch. We've never been in this situation before.
Sorry. That's not you. Just ignore it.
Yeah, thank you. We don't have agreements outside of what we've got with the EU. We have to create new. And for me, it just seems to be a retrograde step to go back from that when we have an organisation, and goodness me, you know, we all accept it's imperfect and it needs reform. And I think we can play a major part. We're one of three big economies in the EU. Not Europe, but Europe too. One of three big economies. We can either take a choice of playing a huge influence on the way that Europe develops and avoid those things which are closer to European Union, fiscal and monetary and economic, and play a huge part in influencing the way Europe develops. We certainly won't do it if we're out of it. So this idea that we can be an influence on our own, I just don't buy. I don't buy that we're better off on our own rather than with one of the three major trading blocs in the world. China, America and Europe. They're the people that are going to influence it. Europe can do deals with the rest of the world. They're doing it already and they're continuing. With Brazil as part of Southern Africa, South American trading group, we can do that with Europe.
It's interesting you mentioned the United States as a trading bloc and China as a trading bloc. It makes perfect sense to me that the Chinese government and the American president both want Britain to stay inside the European Union. That makes perfect sense. Because it's much easier to deal with the European Union as a trading bloc than it is to deal with the European Union and Britain separately. So it's easier for them, I understand that. We're not here to talk about what's easier for America or for China, or trading blocs around the world, or even the European Union trading bloc. We're deciding on June the 23rd what is best for our country. And if you believe it's better to stay in this trading bloc, vote to stay in it. However, I think that we are perfectly capable, as the 5th largest economy in the world, the 4th biggest military budget in the world, a member of the G8, the G20, the UN Security Council, we have, I think, a great future ahead of us. We are perfectly capable of, as the lady talked about, our fishing industry, of reviving and restoring our fishing industry. We're capable of doing that. We're capable of deciding which countries we allow to have visa-free travel to this country. France, Germany, Italy, Portugal, Spain. Let's give them all visa-free travel. We're not pulling up the drawbridge. We're capable of buying into the Erasmus education and cultural programme. We're capable of cutting trade deals with countries that we want to cut trade deals with. We're perfectly capable of doing these things.
Thank you. Yes, right here.
The lady again asked a question about solving global problems.
We've got mic on 2, radio 2, please, today. Thanks.
Yeah, well, a lot of people would agree that probably the biggest global problem facing us all is climate change. And I believe, and I'd like to ask you what you think about this, I believe that the Paris Agreement in last December was historic, and I also believe that the EU has set a standard on agreement on climate change. So I'd like to know your thoughts on that subject, because I don't think that the Britain by itself will solve climate change. I really don't.
I mean, I agree with that. I don't think we'll solve it by ourselves, but it's an international problem. And as I said, well, I thought I was going to say, I might have missed it. The European Union worked as a bloc at the Paris climate talks last year to ensure that these high targets were met. I'll also find out that the very next day the British government then went and cut all subsidies to solar energy and started signing fracking deals. Which for me, that's one of the reasons I really I want to see more international cooperation. I want us to be, it's a give and take relationship. Fine, we lose some stuff and we have to accept some compromise, but at the same time we're helping. We also input into Europe. So we're talking about social welfare, and earlier, yes, British trade unions have done a fantastic job in the past to bring in certain rights, and we have been influencing European social movements and helping their welfare by they were incorporating British things. At the same time, I want to see us incorporating the best out of European countries. I want to see us incorporating the best green ideals that we're seeing coming out of Germany, coming out of Scandinavia, coming out of the Netherlands. I think, like I said, it's give and take. Yes, we lose some, but at the same time we gain a lot, and that's something we should cherish.
Yes,
just very quickly. Back to democracy, actually. I think the ideals that have been promoted to my left are fantastic, and I hope all those in the room and across this country who believe in them will vote for the Green Party, and then we'll have a Green Party in Parliament looking after our needs, and that's democracy. If it's the will of the people in this country, that's absolutely fine, and I'm 100% behind that. But don't forget there's some downsides to this. There are some downsides to the carbon tax that's been implemented across the EU that's hurting economies, it's hurt our steel industry, it's hurting our energy prices. In turn, it hurts the third world as well, because we need to trade with the third world. And I do get a little cross sometimes when we start chastising ourselves, and yet at the same time do very little to help the parts of the world that really do need our help. You know, if we could stop cutting down some of the trees in the Amazon, it would certainly go a long way to help solve some of the problems. But we don't do that. We don't help those economies. At the same time, we put our own energy prices up, and we artificially subsidise things like solar power. But all that's doing is just recycling money around. It means you pay more for your electricity elsewhere. It's not actually doing very much. And we need to stop focusing about what really matters out there. But that's a global problem, not about making ourselves feel better in middle-class countries like this.
Thanks, Nick. We'll take another question. Someone else, somebody who hasn't asked a question, would like to put something? So, oh yes, there is two down the back. Thank you.
I'd like to know from members of the panel, we're facing not just, we're facing a humanitarian crisis in Europe, and I'd like to know from members of the panel how they think coming out of Europe at this time would actually help towards this terribly upsetting problem that's happening now.
Question. Well, I think it's an open question. Who would like to pick it up?
I entirely agree with the lady. The big difficulty is that because the European Union is 28 member countries, a decision about the migrant crisis has to be taken at a 28 country level, which takes a very, very long time. And there's been a proposal this week. I mean, how long did the migrant crisis, or how long has it been going on? A very, very long time. They've finally come up with a proposal this week, and that's just a proposal. We'll see what happens. Last year, the German Chancellor, who I have a lot of respect for, she said that Germany unilaterally would take 1 million migrants to Germany, which I thought was a very magnanimous decision on her behalf, and I kind of wished our Prime Minister had been as generous towards the refugees as the German Chancellor. However, she acted unilaterally because she has the power to do that as one of the most powerful countries in the EU. But in order to get a proposal about the migration crisis to the EU, that has to be a 28-country deal, and that's very difficult to achieve. Were we not part of the European Union, Britain could have very quickly set up camps in the Lebanon, near the Syrian border, Lebanon taking a third of its own population in Syrian refugees. We could have looked at how we could help, but because we're part of a 28-country bloc, it has to be done together. It can't be done individually where you have a unilateral decision. It's a massive crisis.
It could have, but it wouldn't want to. It hasn't wanted to. Have you seen how this government has reacted to this crisis?
But it's a 28-country decision.
But at least, I mean, this might cause but I don't really have faith in our government, and I think it's quite scary. We're talking about democracy over and over again, but 36% of the country voted for this government, and they've decided that they don't want to allow any refugees, or they're going to really close the borders on it. We have a completely broken system. As far as I can tell, the EU is one of our safeguards, it's one of our checks, and whilst it might be a little bit slower, I have faith that if we have a more democratic decision made, and I feel across Europe those decisions are democratic, we will find a reasonable solution, rather than what we've seen with David Cameron and his lot.
This is a really important issue, and there are lessons to be learned. Now, just look around the room and look at yourselves, okay? White and middle class in this place here. You're not going to go very far away. You go up to Wisbech and to Peterborough, where I go regularly speaking to people, and there is a tension in both those places at the moment. There's a tension because I think it's Wisbech is something like 30...
Is this answering the humanitarian question?
Yes, it is. It is. If there's 35% of well, it's not. So there's 35% of the population of Wisbech now are coming as economic migrants in a very short space of time. The issue with the EU is because we cannot control, as the chairman said earlier on, the 500 to 700 million, depending on who you believe, people who can come here, then if the government has stated that it doesn't want more than tens of thousands of migrants coming in, it can only press down on the non-EU migrants. If we were out of the EU, on a point system, we hold up the Australian system as an example, then we can decide who comes in and when they come in and in what numbers. And of course, when there's a humanitarian crisis, then, as we've done forever, we can accept people. But there's a lesson from Australia as well. They had boat people trying to get into Australia who were drowning in the hundreds. And they said, categorically, anybody who arrives in Australia without coming through the proper processes will be shipped out. And those people stopped dying instantly.
Right. Yeah, so I think we've got another conflation here, which I was alluding to, immigration and the humanitarian crisis, which was the question. And that's a huge problem. And it's not a European problem, it's not an EU problem, it's a world problem. And I hesitate to go back in history about the causes of that, and whether our military action in the Middle East has been the causation of it. And then, well, we've got shaking heads.
It was the EU caused the migration problem by recognising minority factors.
I really like to make the panel please. Thanks, yeah. So it's not, it could get very chaotic very quickly if we start to do that. So we won't. Thanks, Brian.
Thank you. So the issue over the humanitarian crisis, wherever its causes, is upon us. And we won't get there other than by collaboration. And whether you think that collaboration is easier by being independent of the EU or together with it is a question of judgment that you have to make for yourselves. But I think our response has been risible, quite frankly. The number of people that we've taken, yes, we have funded actually development of camps in Lebanon and in the area, but it's a pitiful amount that we've put in there. And the fact that we've got economic migration mixed up with the people who are refugees from Syria, for example, is just you know, making the whole thing very difficult to separate out what's going on. But clearly, the number of boat people in the Mediterranean today, sadly many of whom are going to die in the process, is part of a worldwide problem of migration, of political unrest, and we have played our part in that political unrest. If you think that we didn't have bombs going into Benghazi or elsewhere in Libya, perhaps not Benghazi, or elsewhere in the Middle East today, well, that's what we're doing.
Thanks, Brian. Yes, question here. And we had a question before, didn't we? Yes, I did. But that's all right. Well, thanks, the gentleman in the red shirt. Thank you.
First things first, apologies for interjecting inappropriately, obviously I was mentioned. Does the panel not agree that the migration issue has either in a significant part or in full been caused directly by the European Union, which has a history of recognising minorities within sovereign states? They were recognising Syrian minorities, which in part caused a civil war. They made improper and presumptuous recognition of Balkan states, which directly caused the Yugoslav war. Yugoslavia was held as the template of what the European Union should be for many, many years. Moreover, they caused depression in Cyprus, as the gentleman said. I lived in Cyprus for 8 years. There were 500,000 Greek Cypriots that were displaced by the Turkish army in 1974 that are still displaced that the EU has perpetuated. So rather than being the catalyst for solving the migration crisis, as we've seen in Ukraine, Yugoslavia, Cyprus, and now in Syria, rather than solving the migration crisis, and in particular I would add that the EU has given the Turks a waiver as part of a backhand deal on the migrations issue with regard to biometric passports, which will allow 75 million Turks. The point is, rather than solving the migration crisis, is it not the truth that the European Union has actually caused it?
Right, that's a pretty...
Can you clarify what you mean by migration crisis? Are you talking about the crisis now in the Mediterranean? Or?
I'm talking about a significant number of crises over the last 50 years, which is directly caused by the European Union. You've only got to look at Srebrenica as an example of the European Union in all its failure.
Over to the panel.
I don't agree. I think you can blame the European Union for many problems that exist in different parts of the continent of Europe, but I wouldn't make such a generalisation as that. I think you would have to look at very specific individual issues. My big concern with the European Union is the now very unstable migration crisis across the continent. So the crises of refugees in horrifically tragic circumstances, leaving war-torn villages, but then arriving in this safe continent and experiencing this horrendous being shunted all over the place in this migration crisis on our own continent because of what looked 20 years ago like this wonderful dream of visa-free travel, but it's not looking that way at the moment across our continent. There's a lot of misery from the gates of Europe in Turkey all the way to Calais. There is misery, and the European Union is not making it better. I'm not saying the European Union is the cause of that. I'm not blaming for that. But I don't think the visa-free travel and across member states, where now certain member states, like, well, let's name names, say Hungary, is saying, well, we're not coming here. So they're just ripping up the Schengen Agreement, which 20 years ago looked amazing. and the migration crisis is making Schengen look very unstable.
Who else would like to pick up on this?
Can I just very quickly?
Yes.
I think one of the issues that we're dealing with is that, I agree, I don't think the EU has caused the refugee crisis. But what it's done is handled it badly. Like the Australians discovered, if there's an implicit approval, if you can get across the water on a boat that will look after you, people will continue to come, because one of the upsides of the refugee crisis is that it's generally because the poor people of the world aren't quite as poor as they used to be. And they're using what they believe to be discretionary finance to pay £7 or £8 or £10,000 to people traffickers. And that's wrong. And unless we then take the hard attitude the Australians took and said, if you try and come in that way, you will be sent back. And if we were to do that within the EU, a lot of the people trafficking that's going on would stop, because there'd be no economic reason for doing it. And I think then we should be directing our efforts to the country of origin where these poor people live, to help them improve their lives, whether it's through trade or camps, or helping to press down on the people that are causing the war. That's where the problem has got to be solved, because poor people have always gone to rich countries forever. And that is why there have been barriers for migration, to make sure you protect the indigenous population.
Another question. Yes, down front. Oh, sorry. Did you want to pick up on that, Mark?
Yeah, well, there's so many issues in all of this. I don't agree that the British government going into the source of the problem is going to solve anything, because that's what Britain's been doing for the 20th century and just worsening the situation over and over again. So I think if we're going to look for a solution, I wouldn't trust our government going in, as they've done in the Middle East since the 1917 or something. Anyway, on top of this Australian point-based system, it's got its flaws as well, and it's one of the big things we're trying to do, or that's being pushed forward by the exit camp, is that we want to have controls and limit the amount of immigrants coming in to the country. But in Australia, when they brought in the points-based system, net immigration rose, because they don't reject anyone. Once you hit the points, you're in, and that was actually a major flaw in the system.
Hi, I'd like to know about education. How does being in the European Union affect the way what young people are taught and how they're taught? And will that change if we leave?
Probably should go to our educationalist first on this one. And someone else will no doubt disagree with you. So.
Let me understand you directly. You're talking about the curriculum and what we're taught in schools, and whether membership of the European Union has an effect on what pupils are taught in schools.
Yes.
No.
And I can completely agree with that. When I was leading the County Council, of course, the funding for schools used to come through us, and again, I can absolutely know it would be affected at all.
It's always a worry, Steve, when you just go on like you did there, for so long. Another question, please. Yes, gentleman over here.
Hello, it's reference the UK and post-Brexit, the breakup of the UK, potential breakup of the UK. The SNP have indicated that they will have immediately, if Brexit happens, they will have another referendum, and Nicola Sturgeon will probably confirm that at 9 o'clock tonight, which is on ITV. And Northern Ireland is also a risky place for in or out. So it's really getting the panel's opinion on how they see UK after Brexit, if that's were to happen. I'd just like to make a side point. I find the UKIP very patronising and very...
I don't think this is appropriate, sir.
No, it is. But
No.
Mr Farage can stand
We've
up.
got a question to the panel, let's ask a question, but I don't think we should be in the position of putting down one party or another at the moment.
Right, I'll just address it to the output. The outside can be very patronising. All of UK is not middle class. And The car industry in the northeast is Nissan, 40% owned by Renault, of which 20% is owned by the French government.
It's going to be difficult to answer this in 2 minutes, you know.
Yeah, I know.
So
It's a complicated
put a question and
So,
okay. Yes.
But you're asking us to speculate, because you're asking us to speculate about what happens after Brexit.
Well,
so
we have to make assumptions, don't we?
We have to put aside our desire to not speculate to answer your question. And I think it's entirely likely that in the case of Brexit, given the closeness of the vote in the Scottish referendum, independence referendum, that given that they want to remain in Europe, in the EU, they want to stay in the EU, it's more than likely that Nicola Sturgeon will lead them to another referendum if we leave.
I mean, I declare a vested interest because I'm a Scot, so I'm from Edinburgh, and the prospect of Scotland leaving the United Kingdom scares me. But I think that's a very different question from whether we're a member of the European Union. The SNP likes to think that it is the one party of Scotland, the true Scottish patriotic party. Without getting into party politics, I think that the referendum in Scotland is going to be closer than the SNP would like to think, because it's not a vote about whether you support the SNP or not, it's a vote about whether you want to be in the European Union. And the fishing industries in Scotland have been destroyed. And you will struggle to find a single fisherman anywhere in Scotland who is passionately wanting to stay in the European Union. You may find one, but I think you would struggle. And so I think it's going to be very close. If it does come to another referendum, if she does threaten that and then goes through with that, I trust my countrymen north of the border to make the same decision they made it the last time, thinking, are we better off in the United Kingdom with its common language, its common culture, its common identity, its seat at the Security Council, etc. Yes, I do. I trust the Scots to make that decision. But again, I'm speculating. If there is another referendum, it'll be down to whether they want to be part of the UK.
Nick, you're dying to say something.
Well, I think given the size of the mandate that the SNP currently hold, it's not a case of will there be another referendum, it's just when. Nicola Sturgeon may wish to hang it on the EU referendum, but if she doesn't do it there, it'll be hung somewhere else. Because I think she's entitled to do that again. Now, equally, I don't want the breakup of the union, but going back to democracy, I think a large number of SNP people have been elected. But I think the real issue with the Scotland issue, it'll all be decided by the price of oil, actually. And a lot of people have seen in Scotland then a narrow escape by not voting to come out of the union, because the oil price plummeted almost like the day after, didn't it? And their numbers just don't add up now.
Thank you very much. There's a lady down the back there. A hand in the air.
I'd just like to go back to the education question, because I didn't think it got a very big response. I accept that possibly it's not going to make much difference to schools. I think it might make a big difference to adult education and education for the disabled, because as far as I'm aware, a lot of funding comes from Europe for quite innovative projects in adult education, and I fear that those things, does the panel think that those projects will be able to be picked up, will be picked up, will be carried forward, and the innovation that comes from those as well. I think I have some concern about that.
If you like, Sir.
Obviously, the village college community education is a very large emphasis going all the way back to Henry Morris. So that's partly what you're talking about. I'd say two things in response to that. The first is that we do contribute an enormous amount of money to the European Union, and it does come back for projects that you've just described, but it is earmarked for those projects. Now, those projects are good projects, and they should continue, and a government in this country should continue those projects. Which means that those projects will lobby in the normal way for the government to support them with taxpayer-funded money. And if those projects are local and are popular, they are likely to get funding. The second point is, if you're thinking, yeah, but if it's a Labour government or if it's a Conservative government, and I would say to you that this referendum is not about whether you vote Conservative or Labour or Liberal Democrat or Green. It doesn't matter. If you hate David Cameron, I don't care if you wouldn't whatever on him if he was on fire. I don't care. That's not what the referendum is about. It's about the European Union. And so if a future government of whatever colour has this money that we are no longer sending to the European Union and wants to spend it on increased health or increased schools or increased on community projects, that's a good thing. I don't see that that would necessarily cease if we leave the European Union.
Did you want to respond to that, Brian?
Yes, I'm just imagining my nightmare, which is not David Cameron, as the leader of an independent Britain post-Brexit, who will have his mate, George, the Chancellor, making these decisions, although bad enough they would be. It's Bojo, and Michael Gove, and God forbid Trump as a president in the States, with Putin battling over in the East. I don't know where I want to go. I mean, Canada's looking pretty good. They've got a Liberal Prime Minister over there that, quite honestly, I'm a little bit in love with. But I think they'll be full of Americans escaping Trump if he gets in. So that's all I'd like to say. The fact is, we don't have a very good record in the UK of funding projects that the EU does. So I think they're vulnerable.
Mark would like to have a word.
I don't really want to go into a Tory leadership election thing because it's not about that. Like you said, it's not about who the government is. But as I've been saying quite a few times, I feel, if we do leave the European Union, we're going to see very quickly how flawed the system we have in the UK is, and we're not going to be able to stop stuff. And as far as I can tell, that's a dangerous place to be. Until we've reformed our own postal system, I think it's dangerous to leave the EU. It's a check, an important check.
Okay. That's just not true. I'm sorry to say that. Look, when we leave the EU, there will be thousands, literally thousands, of vested interests that need to be looked at. The majority of the things that we do at the moment under EU regulation, we will almost certainly continue doing, because it will allow us to continue trading with the EU without branching away from their rules and regulations. When it comes to things like adult education, and actually more importantly in my case, I'm passionate about adult social care. And in this country at the moment, we don't fund adult social care correctly, we don't see it as a priority. So in amongst those two priorities, how do we want to spend our money? Well, at least we will have the choice, because at the moment, the EU doesn't give us choice. As has been said before, they just allocate money for particular priorities, and to me actually adult social care in this country is one of the biggest priorities that we should be banging on about. But if we've got control of this money, bear in mind we only get £1 back for every £2 we spend, or if we generalise it, we will have choices, and it comes back to who you vote in power and who you don't.
Thank you very much. I think we have time for one more question actually. Yes? Thanks.
Okay, so I think this question is kind of leading on from what we were just talking about. Tonight we've talked about some pretty big issues: humanitarian, border control, trade agreements, economies and things like that. Taking it a little bit smaller, a little bit personal. If we vote to leave, how will that affect me in my daily life?
Can you tell us what you do in your daily life? Do you like to drink?
I work for a living. I'm an employee, I don't own a business. I don't stand to make any extra money by doing a different trade agreement or anything like that. I pretty much don't think my daily life will change whatsoever, whichever way we go.
Interesting question.
Yeah, I think it's a great question, but let's be clear about this. This EU referendum is not about voting to stay in the EU as it is now or leaving. It is about leaving or staying in the EU as it's going to be in 2, 5, 10 and 50 years' time. And the treaties, oblige everybody to seek closer, ever closer union. And David Cameron may be waving a bit of paper that says we don't have to do it anymore, but it's pretty worthless. The whole of the EU project is predicated. So how it will affect you is that there are already plans to homogenise taxation across the European Union. There are plans to homogenise corporation tax across the European Union, and a lot of companies invest in this country because we have low corporation tax. So if you're one of those companies that's come here for that reason, then you may find it'll go somewhere else. Some companies relocated out of the UK to the eastern bloc of the European Union a while ago because there were actually EU incentives for them to do that. Well, I'm hoping that when we come out of the EU, those sort of bizarre incentives will disappear. So I think you'll find life to be, on a day-to-day basis, absolutely the same to start with. Over time, there'll be divergence in certain areas. So, for example, we may wish to pursue the GM food line. The scientists may want to do that where you can't in the EU. If you work in that environment, of course, it'll be more of an opportunity. But the world is not going to stop whether we stay in or whether we leave. We're still going to be a very, very financially successful country. All that happens is the future means that we've got more control of what we do later on.
You timed that to exactly 2 minutes. That's amazing. Brian, you want to pick this up, don't you?
If you don't mind. So I think in the short term, there'll probably be a lot of instability in the markets, and I think the economy will take a hit. I mean, that's certainly what the experts say. I tend to agree with them. Whether you do or not is a different question. I do agree that it's a long-term question. It's not really about the next 2 years or 5 years. And it's not necessarily that the closer union that our UKIP and our Out brigade would have us believe. Because there are a lot of people in Europe that agree with our perspective of not wanting closer union, that don't want to go for homogenised tax, and they don't want a European army, an EU army. So we're back into speculation, is the bottom line. And what we all have to do as individuals, come June the 23rd, is take a rational decision, or we take an emotional decision about some idea that Britain can be great again. And I mentioned the 1970s and going on holiday with all the restraints on cash that you could take with you. But I remember the 60s and the 70s and Edward Heath's 3-day week and going to the IMF for a bailout. We weren't very good, actually, on our own. We were in a bit of a mess. So I lived through it. Okay, I was there. Absolutely. So the idea that the 50s and rationing through the time I was born, to Harold Wilson devaluing the pound, bailout from the IMF, winter of discontent, the 3-day week, the miners' strike, the second miners' strike. Okay, that was, so actually I think that we've got a perfectly good opportunity to influence Europe going forward to not be this homogenised state and work collaboratively with the rest of Europe.
I'd like to say just one thing. I haven't said anything really, but I came here in 2002 for 5 years and I'm still here, so I think Britain is great already. Otherwise I wouldn't be. No, you'd like to pick up on this one. That's because I'm here.
Your day-to-day won't change immediately. If we vote in or out, it won't change the very next days. We've obviously seen a lot of stuff in Daily Mail and all these other great publications making it seem like the end of the world is nigh and all of that. It's not. It is a question, as you were saying earlier, about philosophical outlook in a one way. I think we'll start to see quite quickly a loss of some of the smaller nice things that we see coming out of Europe, talking about the education fundings for various projects. I think we'll see a lot of that will disappear, and it will affect some people, it won't affect all of you. then in the longer run, it's all this uncertainty about economics and finance, which it's all speculation, as the markets always are, as to what happens next. And depending on what you believe, you might believe it'll be fine and we'll just get along fine by ourselves, or you might think, it's going to go downhill.
It's amazing.
I personally, I have a lot of faith in Europe and the people of Europe.
I'm going to just give them a moment to think about it. I'm now going to ask each of the panellists to sum up for us.
Can I respond to the gentleman?
Sorry?
Do you mind if I respond to the gentleman?
No, go ahead.
Yes, please.
So, can I ask, are you a member of the European Parliament?
No.
Right. Because there will be unemployment after June 23rd. There will be 71 job losses. 70 of them will be members of the European Parliament for the United Kingdom, and one of them will be our commissioner on the unelected commission who was appointed by David Cameron. So there will be job losses. I don't think life will change very much at all. Now, I'm speculating, as we said before. The so-called experts who are referred to, interestingly, the experts said in April 1999 that unless we joined the single currency that the vast majority of European countries were building, I quote, we would be voting for economic obscurantism, as if we would be left behind. We would be poor. Mercifully, the British government didn't heed that advice, because the British, generally speaking, are pretty sensible people. I think, generally speaking, we make very good decisions. We also stand up for the weak, generally speaking. We also go to war over things that we believe passionately about. We don't always get things right, but I think we have a lot of common sense. I think the Remain campaign has thrown absolutely everything at you and me that they possibly can to scare you and me about what will happen if we leave. In fact, I think they've done everything apart from a plague of locusts and the death of the firstborn.
I think that's probably coming.
I have no doubt that is coming. I don't think anything will change because I have faith in the British people, and if our government makes a mess of things, we will vote them out at the next election. That's how democracy works. It's not great, but that's how it works.
In just a couple of minutes, I'm going to ask each of the panellists to wrap it up for us, just give a couple of minutes. I'm very grateful to you, gentlemen, for the respectful way that you've heard each other's different points of views, challenged them, but done it in an absolutely civilised way. And thank you, audience, for coming along tonight, because you make this sort of village event what it should be. So thank you for that. I do want to tell you a little story. It happened quite a long time ago. There was a change in Australia. They brought in daylight saving, what you call summertime. And a lady rang up to the local, change always threatens people, doesn't it? We had it for a year. And a lady rang up to the local station, radio station, and she said, I want to talk about daylight saving. And the fellow said, yes, what do you want to say? She said, well, ever since they brought it in, I've noticed that my curtains are fading a lot faster. So, there's reality in myth, and we're all subject to it. And I hope tonight has helped you to understand the subject a little more. I hope it's helped you to decide that you will vote, even if you're not sure, because that is our privilege as free people to vote. Would you like to just move across from this side to that side, take 2 minutes each, and tell us what you would like to say in your summary? You go back the other way if you like, I don't mind, just do it.
I didn't think of wrapping up my for this evening, so I'll just
have to fill 2 minutes, Mark.
Okay, yeah, that's a good point, doesn't have to fill 2 minutes. Like you said, it's been quite a nasty campaign nationally. There's been a lot of scaremongering. I wouldn't blame it all on Remain, it's just been as bad on the Brexit side. I think at the end of the day, I'm going to my decisions based and predicated on the people I trust, the people I value, and the kind of ideas and philosophies that I believe in, which obviously they go quite deep, and it's difficult to explain them all in a 2-minute thing. I think for me it's very clear that the Brexit campaign is not well thought out. It's just let's leave it and see what happens. And for me that's a dangerous step. I don't see any concrete plans, any ideas of what will happen, and all for what, really. That's the big question, like, why are we doing this? Is this idea to regain democracy? As I've said, I don't think we have a democratic system in the UK, and I think the only thing that's currently making it have any checks there is the EU. So until I see real reform in the UK, and I see then, only then, would I even consider trying to lead the campaign.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. I think this referendum provides us with an opportunity to reposition our country, and I think the debate so far, not so much here but nationally, has all been about facts and figures to support whichever side that you're on. But mindful of where we are at the moment, I guess it's a little bit like a faith, isn't it? You have to understand what is fundamentally right, even when there's not as much evidence around as you perhaps would like. But intrinsically, you can understand what is right and what is wrong. And what is wrong with the EU at the moment is that, like a large number of organisations, it is too big, it's too meddlesome, it's too bureaucratic, it's too inefficient, and it doesn't do enough good. It does meddling. And on that basis alone, I think you should be voting to leave. I'm also passionate about the democratic principles of this country. And whether we've got the right system or not is a valid point. You know, from my perspective, I think we should have PR or something, but it doesn't matter actually. If I get enough people to support my view in this country, then we will vote in MPs who can change it and we'll have PR. But you don't have any of those abilities in the EU. You know, we've got an opportunity to regain our seat at the World Trade Organization. And we've also got an opportunity to prepare ourselves for what is a really modern, vibrant world out there, where economies are emerging so fast. When you take India and China and Brazil and elsewhere, and the EU is an organisation that is slow to react to most things. It's not fleet of foot like we are. And we know that small organisations can react extremely well where large ones don't. We've seen British home stores collapse recently, where small independents on the internet shops are thriving. So small is sometimes much better. But let's get, just very quickly, there are 155 countries in the world who trade freely with the EU, but they're not all governed by them. There's 195 countries in the world, and we're talking about a small block of 28, of which 19 have got one currency. We need to be brave and open our eyes and see what's actually happening and start taking charge of our destiny again.
Thank you. I'm going to go back to where I started and say that I am a passionate European, and I always will be. I want to work with Europe, all the countries of Europe, those in the European Union and those outside of the European Union. I want peace across the continent of Europe. I want cooperation. I want trade. I don't have fear about what the future holds when I cast my vote to leave the European Union, and I don't wish them any harm. I wish them well. I hope it succeeds. I was with them last year, but I have come to the conclusion that it is not in our interests to stay in this European Union. And I like to think of, as an historian, someone like Christopher Columbus, when he set sail, and he must have been told by so many people, why are you taking such a big risk? Why don't you stay with what you know? Okay, 15th century Europe's a bit grubby, there's a bit of religious strife here and there, but you're going into the unknown. Well, he was brave enough to take that risk. And there are lots of people throughout history that have taken that risk. Neil Armstrong, Francis Drake, Captain Cook. People who have taken a risk. And I want to take that risk on June the 23rd. But I also want to cooperate with our European neighbours, trade agreements with them, I want to cooperate militarily with them, I want to be best friends with them. Because we owe them a lot. They also owe us a lot. Because British men and women lie dead on the continent of Europe in graves. Because we love Europe so much.
Wow. Well, it has been very simple, hasn't it? Which is nice to see. And I still maintain my position. I don't see Europe as meddling. I believe it's very well meant. I don't think it's perfect in putting legislation through. I think we could do with a huge amount of reform in that process. We've got the bonkers stuff of two parliaments where Brussels make the legislation and then they have to up tools and go to Strasbourg to actually vote it through. I mean, absolute nonsense. Everybody knows it, it needs a treaty change, and that's very difficult to go through. So we've got a very imperfect system. There are things about the business aspect of doing business with Europe and the world that are relatively complicated. There are things like non-tariff barriers to trade, which is really referring to things like the regulations around food processing, whether it's genetically modified crops, whether it's the difference between the American systems, which are much more laissez-faire than the European protection. My wife works for the MRC and she sees very clearly the difference in that legislation. So we've got a choice. We've got a choice of leaving that existing establishment behind and redoing all those trade negotiations that are imperative for our financial success. There would be a huge amount of work to be done, a huge burden on this country that I don't think is worth spending the time, money and resource in a time of austerity for this country that will continue for some time. So my position is that we are better off in and looking to reform that and to stop the European project in terms of closer union. And on June 23rd, I'm going to, and I would like us to vote to remain in. Thank you.
There's two things I'd like to do. One is to thank you very much, gentlemen, for putting yourselves in the firing line. It's a brave thing to do, and I appreciate your service to our community in doing that. Thank you very, very much indeed. Can we thank you? Last thing I'd like to do is I'd like to pray for our country. If you don't share my faith, that's fine. Can you just, in your own heart, wish us well, please? But if we could stop for a moment. Lord God, you know how many good and silly decisions we human beings make. And sometimes we make good decisions on silly motives, and sometimes we make silly decisions on good motives. But please help our country to make a good decision, not just for ourselves, but for the world in which we live, for the people who are affected by everything we do. Help us to use our great power for justice and for mercy. Be with us as we come to this time. Give us wisdom, we pray. Amen. Thank you so much, folks, for coming tonight. Thank you for the way you have comported yourselves. Please do travel safely home, and I hope you all make a good decision on that day. Thank you.